For those of you just joining us, just letting you know, we do have some of our task force members who are going to be arriving momentarily, and we're just waiting for them.
And Nara Delvaca is now in the room. We're going to go ahead and get started because we have quorum. So we're going to call this meeting to order at 1:05 p.m. I just want to welcome everybody who's joining us either in the conference room or online. And Andrew, either if you want to do attendance, that would be fine, or if you...
Yeah. We can go on to our roll call. We have our agenda in front of us, as you guys know. So for a roll call of attendance for our task force members, William Weiss.
Present.
Dan Coppinger is not present. And Catherine Vanderwall. All right, you're muted in the courtroom.
Sorry about that.
It's okay.
Can you hear us now?
I can hear you now.
Great.
And Catherine, that's present, I'm assuming.
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay. Rebecca Harper, I believe, is in the Zoom room.
Present.
And Jennifer Smith just joined us.
I'm here.
And Nara Dalbaca.
I'm here.
And Robert Geary does not appear to be online. And a representative from the fire districts.
Paul's here. Paul Blues.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Moving on to consideration of the minutes from the Cannabis Ordinance Task Force meeting from April 24th, 2023.
So if everyone has had a chance to review those minutes, we can take a motion.
I'll move that we accept and file the minutes from the April 24th meeting.
Great. We have a motion from Will Weiss. Do we have a second?
Second.
Second from Nara Delvaca.
Want to do a roll call motion?
Yes, please.
Okay. William Weiss.
Yes.
Dan Coppinger is not present. Catherine Vanderwall.
Yes.
Rebecca Harper.
Yes.
Jennifer Smith.
Yes.
Nara Dalbaca.
Yes.
Robert Geary is still not present. And Paul Blues.
And Paul, did you have a vote on the minutes?
Showing Paul is muted.
Sorry, I got another phone call on the other line. I missed the last 10 to 15 seconds.
We were just doing roll call for approval of the minutes.
I approve.
Thank you.
Okay, moving on. Okay, the Lake County Cannabis Alliance has offered to take the lead on a few topics for today's meeting. I think Jennifer Smith is going to be starting off with this, and then we also have some input from Nara Delbaca. So I'm going to open it up to Jennifer. And Jennifer, I do have some of those documents you wanted to share a screen with. I have those ready up on request when you're ready for them.
Right. Thank you, Andrew. I'm actually on my way in. I'd like to start with the state updates from NARA.
Okay. I have a couple of those bullets. So, Nara, would you like to go ahead? So Nara's going to briefly cover, my understanding is some of the state regulations, a quick history, and then how they've progressed, and especially how we are where we are to have a task force like this to update the ordinance, partially in response to changes in state regulations, and also after a few years of, some experience with this new industry. So with that said, I'm going to leave it up to you, Nara.
Okay, I'm trying to pull up some text from some of the bills I want to talk about today. But just cannabis, as I think we all possibly now became legalized for recreational use under Prop 64, which is also known as ALMA, which is the Adult Use of Marijuana Act. And that was voted on in 2016. Prior to that, we were operating under SB 420 and Prop 215, medical cannabis. Prop 64 allows for changes to it either through the regulatory process at the state level, which is through traditional rulemaking, and also via the Cannabis Advisory Committee, which is a committee a little bit like this one, but it's a statewide committee that meets and discusses various cannabis policy elements. It can also be changed by statute at the legislature by a 2/3 vote for a more significant amendment, but that amendment would need to further the purpose and intent of Prop 64. There are other 50% measures that are a little more directly related to implementation of what's existing in statute. So SB 94 was the very first bill that was passed by the legislature governing cannabis regulations and adopting the Adult Use of Marijuana Act. And it created the 3 bureaus that that initially oversaw cannabis. That was was CDFA that oversaw cannabis cultivation. There was the MCSB, the Manufactured Cannabis Safety Branch, and that oversaw manufacturing. And then there was the Bureau of Cannabis Control that oversaw distribution and retail. And those 3 agencies were under a recent change to the state, rolled in and under a budget change, which is another way that through statute changes can be made to cannabis regulation at the state level. Those were rolled into a single bureau, the Department of Cannabis Control. And over the last couple of years, since the rulemaking process in 2017, the largest changes in the regulation of cannabis happened as a result of that, as a result of the combining of those 3 bureaus into a single department. And it was meant to be make things a little bit easier and streamline the process. It hasn't necessarily proven to be that, but that was the attempt, and that was the idea behind combining those 3 agencies. But there were 3 agencies operating with their own 3 sets of regulations. Those of us who tracked those through, there was a lot of discussion as those three full sets of regulations became a single set of regulations. And that's the large packet that Andrew sent out to everybody when we were discussing the potential changes and discussion around definitions. So those first 8 pages were that of the 300 are the current regs for cannabis under the regulatory process. And the reason we're talking a little bit about that today is because a lot of those changes at the state level will affect how things are implemented on the ground here. Some of the changes that came through last year were a regulatory change that allowed for hoop houses for outdoor growers. And that was a major change, and that's something that's been discussed ad nauseum at the Board of Supervisors here. But it's one of the ways that we can see how that trickles down and affects us here. So as we're moving forward and looking at this ordinance, some of these new laws and statutes that come into play that were adopted last year in last year's regulatory session will begin to affect us now or at the time of that they become active laws. Last year, another change that was made was in AB 195. It was AB SB 195. That was the governor's budget trailer bill specific to cannabis. That changed the way that the state collects and oversees the tax of cannabis. That was the largest change in that one. And there were some other significant changes around enforcement and what that allowed for. And you hear me talk about 195 a lot. I bring it up because there were mechanisms in there that allowed for local jurisdictions to try to seek to get reimbursement for the enforcement of unlicensed cannabis. There are some additional bills this year that are up that would actually materially affect that as well, probably in a positive way for the county for licensed cannabis.
Nora,
Yeah.
could you explain what the tax change
For folks that happen.
Sure. So, but prior to the middle of last year, or July of last year, cannabis was taxed at both at both the cultivation level and then each license type was also paying an excise tax of 15% of the designated markup rate that was identified by CDTFA every year, and not actually on gross receipts, which is a little bit simpler. And then the cannabis cultivation tax was a per pound tax that was a flat rate, that when the price of cannabis plummeted in the last couple of years, went from being about 10% of the tax to sometimes well over 50%, or sometimes more than the actual cost of the cannabis in the case of trim last year, when it was going for something like $50 or $25 a pound. The tax was actually higher than the cost per pound. It was very hard to oversee and to implement. That tax was then collected and held by the distributor, and the distributor also collected and held the excise taxes for every other license type, and then remitted all of that to the state. That got very complicated because distributors were not always being paid on time by the retailers, and so they didn't have the cash on hand to pay the taxes that were owed. And it was very, very hard for CDTFA to figure out how to audit what the cultivation tax was. And it was bringing in maybe $120 to $150 million a year to the state, and the cost of overseeing that tax was actually higher than potentially as costly as the tax itself. So it became simpler for them to change the way that the tax was collected. The distributors are no longer responsible for collecting or remitting any taxes to the state of California. That all happens now at the bottom of the receipt in the retail, in a retail location. So that excise tax is now 15% of the cost, the gross receipt, or the cost of the product, which is the markup rate is actually a little bit higher at retail than the 80% that CDTFA used to designate, or they would put out every year, whatever the markup rate was. So there was a bit of an effective tax increase on that 15%. It became 15% that's a little bit higher than the 15% it was before, which is a little complicated. But the idea was to simplify it, made it a lot easier for the state to audit, it made it a lot easier for the state to collect, and it was a lot cleaner. It was a revenue neutral solution because the state is currently backfilling any potential losses in the cannabis tax, and as we've seen legal cannabis sales fall, and there's a required baseline for some of the cannabis tax dollars that was set on the 2021 level, which is the highest that cannabis has ever sold at. There was a $622 million baseline set for the tier 3 recipients of the cannabis tax. So any shortfall to that $622 million is currently being backfilled by the state. If after 3 years that shortfall still exists, the California Department of Taxes and Fees will likely increase the cannabis excise tax to up to 19%. And that's something that a lot of us in the industry are pretty concerned about.
All right, I'm going to stop you just
Yes.
right there. Andrew, I just want to make sure we're recording because I can't see that on my end.
Yes, we are recording.
Awesome.
All right.
Thank you.
Sure. So that was the major tax change that happened last year, and then we talked a little bit about the enforcement items that were also in 195. The major things that happened at the statute level are looking to expand access to cannabis, hone and expand enforcement of unlicensed cannabis, and ensure that the implementation is going as smoothly as it possibly can. And that tends to be the three buckets that the bills fall under. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about a few bills that are up this year, so we can see how they'll affect the ordinance here at the local level in Lake County.
So Nara, just so I understand, these are bills that are not actually signed yet?
These bills are not signed yet. There are a in any given legislative session, there's between 15 and 35 cannabis bills that get passed. And then those have to go into the Department of Cannabis Control to be turned into regulations. Or they go to their respective department to be turned into regulations. Some of the ones for this year you'll affect the Water Resources Board and some of the other licensing agencies that are still involved in approving or reviewing cannabis state licenses. So let's see. So some of the access bills that are around this year, there's one that would create a new license type for cannabis catering, and that would allow for someone to become a cannabis caterer at the state level, and they could then carry cannabis with them and bring it to a licensed cannabis event that would, and they would be able to serve and to retail cannabis at under that new license type. There's another one that's a cannabis cafes, and that would expand the ability for on-site consumption and what's allowed on-site. Right now, you can't have unpackaged or prepared food or drinks, non-alcoholic. And this would allow for the sale and preparation of non-cannabis food and drink items to be served alongside the retailing of cannabis. There's a bill that was passed last year that affects employment in the state of California, and that says that testing positive for cannabis is no longer and should no longer be a fireable or non-hireable offense. And that's just to reflect that the state of California believes that cannabis smoking is no longer a crime, and that one won't go into effect until 2024. So that's why I'm mentioning it now, even though that's been signed into law. There are a couple of CEQA bills. There's one in the Senate and one in the Assembly that are similar. It's Assembly Member Bonta in the lower house, and in the Senate, it's Senator Laird out of Santa Cruz. And those are CEQA bills. Those would change a little bit about the approval process at the county level and the state level. Right now, there's a large CEQA component of your state license, and this bill would say, if your local jurisdiction says that you get a negative declaration, or they've adopted exactly. A mitigated neg deck, let me pull it up. So there's three.
Programmatic EIR?
Yeah, programmatic EIR, if there's, or if, where is this? Hang on. God, why is this font is enormous on this right now? There we go. Okay. So I'll pull up the Bonta version is a little bit broader than the Laird version. The Laird version was introduced last year and was not passed. This one would state that requires that the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA, requires a lead agency as defined to prepare or cause to be prepared and certify the completion of an environmental impact report on a project that, so I think we all know what CEQA does. This would say that CEQA does not apply to specified actions taken by the department or a local jurisdiction that authorize commercial cannabis consisting of retail, distribution, manufacture, or laboratory testing if the specified conditions are met. So this would mean that this would be furthering the intent and purpose of Prop 64, because they really wanted local control to be paramount and to be where the decisions about cannabis are made. And right now, because everything that gets done at the local level then has to get filtered through the state level, it holds up the approval when the locals have already said that this is that CEQA does not that it's a CEQA compliant project. And this would say that if your local jurisdiction says that you're good with CEQA, then you're good with CEQA. And that could be really helpful in terms of getting folks on the ground and operating. And that would potentially change some of the wait times that people have for getting their licenses approved. One example of an enforcement bill that would be that's under consideration this year is from Senator Caballero out of the Central Coast and sort of Central California area, where they also have a lot of unlicensed cannabis being cultivated. This would make it a crime for a person 18 years or older to plant, cultivate, harvest, dry, or process more than 50 living cannabis plants or any part thereof, except as specified, and that's now making it a crime punishable by imprisonment in a county jail for up to 6 months. And so it is a creation of a new crime again, and a lot of that has to do with whether water is being diverted or illegal pesticides are being used. There's also a bill. There's a large account receivable debt.
I would say that's a big shift because up until recently, it's been just a code violation.
Right.
So now there'll be some criminal activity behind it for illegally cultivating.
Yes, and it gives some teeth to local jurisdictions as well. And there's one from Assemblymember Blanca Rubio, who's out of Southern California, and this one allows for a licensed cannabis business to sue in civil court an unlicensed cannabis business that's materially affecting their business, and receive some damages, including attorney's fees, up to $500,000. And that's another ability for some additional teeth in the enforcement. There's another enforcement bill this year that would allow for local governments with an administrative procedure to give them a mechanism to swiftly address illegal cannabis in their communities. And there was some of that was done under AB 195 last year, as I said, but this is further codifying which agencies are allowed and how they're allowed to go after unlicensed cannabis. It also there's a couple of other bills that state that 50% of the monies that are received from those violations go to repay the cost of having these investigations, and 50% of that money can go into the general fund. And so that could be helpful, as the cannabis industry continues to feel the economic crunch, that counties and other local jurisdictions can help offset those losses that they're seeing in taxes through enforcement actions against unlicensed cannabis. And so again, in a county like Lake, where it's estimated that 80 or 90% of the cannabis that's being grown is not licensed, it gives some teeth to the county, and it gives, and that might be something that we want to look at as well, if that bill passes. So all of these bills have made it out of their respective initial committees. They are moving through the process. And need to be signed into law. They need to make it out of the House of Origin, which is the house where they're introduced, by the end of May. And so that deadline is fast approaching. And then they go into the House they have not been heard in. So if it's an Assembly bill, it gets heard in the Senate. If it's a Senate bill, it gets heard in the Assembly. And they have until September 14th to get out of that second House through their policy committees and the floor vote, and then the governor has until October 14th to sign or veto any of those bills. And I think that's most of what I had to talk about. If people have questions on other specific bills, I'm happy to answer them, or if LCC wants me to hit any other things on the state level.
I think that was a good overview of a lot.
Talk quickly. Yes, and exactly. And the point, as Jennifer just said, is that this is really dynamic, where we are building the plane as we're flying it, at the state level and at the county level. And that's why these discussions are ongoing, because these massive changes are happening every year. And we need to be able to adapt and respond to them. So.
Cool. Thank you, Nora.
Mhm.
That's interesting. So the title of the item is Review of Zoning and License Types Allowed in County of Lake. Do we have anything for that?
We have, so I think there's a couple other slides that I submitted to Andrew that were in introduction.
Yeah,
Or where
yeah.
we're at in the sequence.
Super.
So we started with state.
We're building towards that, yeah.
Okay.
with all this.
Yeah, it was just Jennifer was a little late coming in, and so she requested that Nara touch upon
Yeah,
this as a foundation that, I mean, it's the precursor of what leads to how our zoning and license types are allowed. So, and changing constantly.
I
So,
think it is important for this task force to also be mindful of the changes that could be coming, because as we are going through holistically on the process, it helps to know where the state's moving towards as well.
that
So-
said, Jennifer, you want to go ahead?
Absolutely. So Nara touched on point number 2, changes in state cannabis regulations. And I'm going to touch base on commercial cannabis market trends. I know that everybody has heard over the last 2 years that there's been an oversupply, that we can't sustain the taxes and fees that are required of the commercial farming. So I'm not going to belabor that. What I will say is that we've seen about a 30% drop in licenses, which is sad for the industry because most of those are what we call legacy farmers that were not given the promised 5 years to ramp up their businesses due to some last minute licensing change. And so we've seen significant fallout of the small farmer, which greatly affects small rural communities. So it's definitely nothing to celebrate, but with that loss of legal cultivation canopy, we are seeing some movement in both sales in general and the price of those sales. So there's been an uptick in the amount of demand, and there's been an uptick in that price. So I think that it bodes well for the industry, bodes well for our communities that we're able to sustain a business that provides jobs and commerce to our communities.
There is one state bill this year that would allow for fallowing, but that won't be allowed for a couple of years. I think, we needed it last year, but it would identify a lower license fee that you would pay to remain active and not farm.
Right. And we do have that currently at the county level,
Yep.
which is fantastic. Farmers were able to fallow their fields without any penalties. We are seeing an uptick in production based upon these, I would say this better news, these better sales. We are seeing some increase in licensing, as well as people turning their farms back on from being fallowed last year. So I'm hopeful, but still, I would say in a precarious position that with more cultivation coming back online, we might find ourselves in the same situation that we were in 2022. My position is that it's agriculture, it's an agricultural commodity, and this is pretty typical trends in farming. And we are, it'll be interesting to see what's sustainable and what we get to. We're all still learning, both as consumers and manufacturers of cannabis. As far as other market trends, so we are seeing an increase in outdoor cannabis sales and a demand for outdoor cannabis products. And this is twofold. This is the consumers changing their demand in terms of wanting to use and prefer sun-grown cannabis. And a lot of that is driven by the knowledge of the terpene profiles that are produced in cannabis. And it has been shown that outdoor sun-grown cannabis has a higher terpene profile, and those terpene profiles are the entourage effect that people are seeking in terms of it might give you energy, it might relax you, it might be more of an anti-inflammatory. This other reason that there's an increase in outdoor demand is that it is those terpenes being stripped out for a lot of the concentrates, whether it be a rosin or the terpenes extracted for topicals. So those are two, I bring that up specifically because most of Lake County's cultivation is outdoor.
And there was a state bill that changed the way and the type of flavoring that you can add into cannabis vape products, which then affects our farmers here. So
Yeah. So I think in the interest of time, I think those are the two most important trends that are relevant to Lake County. And so with that, I think we're going to touch on some truths and myths. Truths, and say that 3 times.
Yeah, Sarah, Policy Director for LCCA, and I think to just kind of summarize what Jen said, the context is ever changing, and it's impossible to draw any conclusions about the cannabis market right now. You know, we're seeing just classic fluctuations from boom and bust cycles, and it's still a very, very young market. And so when, you know, don't believe the headlines necessarily when it's like, we have a rampant oversupply in California. Well, that's not exactly true. It's about when is that supply available and what is the quality and what is the price point of that supply, you know, so it's far more dynamic than that. So when you see one headline that's saying one thing, there could also be an increase in the price that farmers are getting, an increased demand, and people ramping up their farms this year. So how that translates on the ground, you know, we're here trying to clear as many regulatory pathways as possible so that when conditions are good, farmers can farm and not be, you know, overregulated and overburdened. The other thing you hear about in the news is that, you know, a lot of cannabis businesses can't pay their taxes. And that is both true and a myth. And this is where it gets complicated, you know, because here in Lake County, facts are you cannot farm unless you are true up with the county. So anybody who is a regulated farmer has paid the county their taxes, and that's what allows them to continue operating. And you know, that's both an incentive for the county to keep people in the regulated system, and it's just, you know, anytime we hear that you know, people aren't paying their taxes, it can't happen here. And one of the reasons why people are true up with the county who've stayed in the regulated market, because this county was, I would say, proactive about setting up a a tax structure that acknowledged the changing market conditions and independent of the state. And what the state did with tax reform, as you heard from Nara, is it didn't lessen the tax burden for operators. It shifted who had to pay that tax, and it actually increased it. But it did not mean that when the cultivation tax went away, that farmers were getting a higher price for their product. They were getting the same price, just minus the tax, because the retailer still had to pay that tax, and it was actually an increased tax rate to the state of California. So who's having a hard time paying their taxes is those retailers. And who really loses in that situation is the consumer. Because the consumer, you know, had the promise of safer, legal cannabis through the dispensaries, but that price keeps going up. And we know that, you know, people's amount of disposable income is, you know, kind of declining. We're living, you know, the bigger context that we're in is inflation, right? So there are people having a hard time paying their bills. It is overtaxed. It is overregulated. We talk about that a lot, right? But it's also true that to be here operating in Lake County, you've got to be paying your taxes. So that's, I think, an important point to make, and that perceived oversupply at certain times in the year doesn't necessarily mean that we don't need more cultivation or that our operators don't need to survive. So we hear that a lot as well in the policy discussions. I know we want to move forward into the zoning regulations, but I just want to ask Nara or Jen, are there any other truths or myths that you would like to bust in this quick briefing?
I don't think so at this time.
Okay. The last thing I want to add, and we're going to get into this as we talk about the license types, is that one of the challenges is that farms have a really hard time selling direct to consumers. And that's because of the larger regulatory structure that we're under. And many of the recommendations that we have proposed around retail and that we're going to propose as we move into the zoning chart are to create some pathways that in no way bypass the onerous regulations of having to become a state registered retailer, state licensed retailer, and then go through metric and all those systems, but at least to open up some pathways that can forge that relationship, because it creates more diversification for a farm, especially in a rural county like this. And many counties have been behind because of the burdens of CEQA and permitting and licensing on opening up some license types that would allow some simple things like tasting rooms, like we've talked about here. So those are actually very important as we look at a volatile and ever-changing market, to create those pathways. And that's a main goal that we have going into talking about the rezoning and the work that this group is going to do, and then eventually looking at, you know, the cultivation ordinance itself. We have to keep this ship afloat while we build a better one. Yeah.
Indeed.
So I can introduce this if you'd like, Jen. We wanted to kind of summarize, one of the conversations that we had at the last task force meeting is, let's stop a piecemeal approach where we're talking about a bite-sized little thing, and let's look at the whole picture and come up with more holistic regulations, so we don't get swayed in the wind by any question or recommendation that comes in. So we put together this list of 4 things that we feel are the most beneficial sequence for doing the policy work in this group. And first is work that we've already done. As you know, farmers need to be able to dry their product on their farms, and that was the drying structures language. I don't know if, Mariah, you have any update about when that might be coming forward to the BOS, but this task force already completed those recommendations.
Yes, and so the board separated the temporary hoop structure from the rest of the ag structure ordinance. I think Andrew is working on the CEQA for that right now.
Right, there was
Yes.
you needed.
It came down to the environmental review and the differences between the two.
Do you have an estimated timeline on that, Andrew?
Not today, but like everything else, I'm working hard on it.
So TBD on that. That's a primary importance for this season, right? Like
Yeah.
we need to figure that out. So that's why we put it on the top here.
I guess I could say that with the goal, and one of the reasonings between separating the two is the hoop houses for outdoor cultivation was so time sensitive, needed to be done pretty much last month, but there's still just a little bit of time, not much for really too many people to make plans, but that was kind of as far as ordering it and seeing what could be done and what couldn't be done. It couldn't be done right now. It needs to go through that environmental review, but with that said, it is understood that time is of the essence.
Yeah, and it's common sense. Like, you've got to grow it before you dry it, but you also know that you need to know that you're going to be able to dry it to grow it. So that's where we're at with that. So that's the first item. Next, what we would like to propose to the task force is that we develop, that we do a redrafting of what is referred to as the facilities ordinance. And this is planning speak for anything that's not cultivation. So if we took the cultivation license type out of it, everything else would be left, which is manufacturing, distribution, retail, delivery, events, and testing. So all of the others, and these are commonly addressed in separate ordinances because they're kind of a different beast, right? Cultivation is all about farming. And so many counties have split them up. And what we wanted to propose here is that, what we did with the retail is we took like one little section of retail, and we didn't even address all of the retail types because the board had made some comments to the task force, like, can you help us consider retail and how we can put some constraints on it? So we put together those recommendations, and since they have not yet gone forward to the board, we wanted to make this proposal that perhaps we can just do all of the facilities, all of those non-cultivation license types in one fell swoop and one cohesive ordinance. So it goes forward and we don't piecemeal anymore, because many of them are connected, where you manufacture and then where you sell. This can be on one simple zoning chart. And what Jen will present next is we put together a draft zoning chart of where those different activities could be performed in the county based on what we thought is compatible zoning. So that could be an actionable next step that the task force could jump right into that, look at the zoning chart we put together. We could start workshopping it ad hoc if we need to, like we did with the last one, but it would allow us to kind of break form from the piecemealing to let's look at a whole ordinance and then conduct review on that whole ordinance and then move on and then tackle cultivation next. This will be, I think, less complicated The cultivation ordinance is kind of the whale, right? In certain aspects, because we get into a lot of, the zoning is just the beginning, right? And then we have to look at the other things, and cultivation is more complicated. Also, we have cultivation presently, but we don't have all of the facilities permits available in Lake County. And as the industry matures and grows, we're many years in now, it would be good to look at how we can better serve by offering essentially more vertical integration, so that less farms have to transport their stuff out of county because they would have more services within the county, or be able to diversify their businesses more, such as opening a tasting room like this task force has already recommended. So in terms of sequencing, that would be really advantageous, we think, if we could tackle that next as a group, and probably be done pretty efficiently. It would also be great to be talking about all the facilities at once. So fire is having a comprehensive discussion about fire safety for all the facilities, and we don't do it for every single hoop house, for example, that we look at all the buildings, and then let's look at code that makes sense for everything. Because we see that is just kind of a continual hang up. Then we would recommend a comprehensive rewrite of the cultivation ordinance. And we've prioritized that second because there's no way we can get this all done, in time for this growing season. So it's more like we're looking towards next year with that anyway. That allows us, like I said, build the boat while trying to keep this one, build a new boat, build a better boat while trying to keep this one afloat. And that would, I think, be the best order of operations. And then because of the changing state laws around CEQA and looking at counties' ordinances, we are now in the time period where adopting a discretionary use permit ordinance is no longer CEQA exempt. The ordinance we currently have was at a county level. Individual projects have to go through CEQA, but the whole county didn't have to, because you adopted that ordinance in time before that deadline. So a new ordinance would have to go through an EIR, which was also going to delay things a bit. And that is another reason why we would put that kind of towards the end of the list, because we know that's going to take a while, but allow us to do some other cleanup first. So I think that is, and I will add that programmatic EIR is ultimately going to lessen some of the project-specific CEQA review for every operator in Lake County. So the ultimate payoff is going to be great. It's also going to help answer a lot of the questions that get raised when individual permits come up for review about what are the cumulative impacts. Well, nobody really knows the cumulative impacts. Like, farms can do their best to do the hydrology studies and all of the different studies that are required, but they're not responsible for saying, how does that add up with all of the other farms in the county? What's the math there? And that's what a programmatic EIR is meant to look at and give the county more of a perspective on the whole capacity. So that's our 4
Short goals.
Yeah, right?
Okay, I'm gonna speak to a minute. This chart right here, we have another one that LCCA has provided, which I'll share here in a second. I threw this one in because this is the chart as it currently exists within Article 27 of our zoning ordinance. Essentially, you have your different zones up here. You've got your different license types here, and there are other links on the website that can that provide definitions and descriptions. We have a document that LCCA provided as well, so we can look them up as needed. Again, like Jen mentioned, outdoor cultivation is primarily what the county deals with. That's the type 3 license right here. And then again, the code for this chart with a solid dot, it would require a major use permit. And if it's a hollow dot there, it would require a minor use permit. With that said, I'm going to exit the PowerPoint there and bring up. Okay, are you guys seeing this chart?
Yes.
Okay, let me know if you need me to zoom in on it a bit. But yeah, I can navigate as needed. Just let me know.
Okay, and I've printed copies here for those that are present. Basically what we've done here is we've gone through the zoning chart that was provided, and we've added the license types that are currently not discussed in any ordinance here in Lake County. And we've made some some recommendations. And so I wanted to bring this to the task force to start this discussion, specifically so that we have a path to licensure for every type. Hopefully that we can turn them all on. And then once we decide, like where that zoning is, then in my mind,
Copy? Do you have extras?
I said, you have it digitally. So,
Okay,
so
got it.
sorry.
No problem.
Where was I? So we can begin that zoning discussion here as a group by looking at our recommendations and see what we can agree upon. And then from there, go to the development standards of each license type moving forward. And then go into the changes in cultivation that with the existing ordinance that's in place. So kind of starting with what we don't have at all, moving into what's existing and how we can make it more user-friendly.
So sorry, where is what we don't have at all on here?
At the very bottom,
Okay.
where it starts, there's a gap.
Oh, the red,
And then it says-
the red as opposed to the black.
Correct.
Okay.
And then the retail storefront type 10 is where we started it. And actually, so those first 4 are what we've already recommended, and I have copies of that in our retail ordinance from the task force. And so I just wanted to, and I also gave you guys a copy of the zoning. But the license types that we have not discussed in the county at all would be the event organizer license, which would also dovetail into the conversation about temporary special events, the nursery license, and the manufacturing S license. And that S license, I think the others are pretty explainable, but that S license is a shared space. So if you were to have a manufacturing license location, you would register as a type S so that you could, kind of like a commercial kitchen, how it leases space out. If you can think of it that way, it would be the same type of model.
That can be really helpful, and it's in place in a number of cities for very small farms, family farms, or social equity licensees, because it doesn't involve the startup cost of getting your own facility going, and so there would be a holder of the S-type license, and then people would apply to manufacture in that facility.
But there are also manufacturing licenses that are not S-type.
Correct.
Just want to clarify.
Yes.
So there will be folks who can set up a manufacturing business that processes only their own product. Help me understand.
Or others, yes. And
Or others. So
yeah.
what is the difference between them and a type S?
Who owns the license?
Well, that and the other license would not necessarily be able to lease out the space in the license.
Okay.
It would be whoever holds that manufacturing license would be responsible for the actual activities.
I see. Okay.
And some of those were already, the reason S is listed down below is because that does not exist in this county at this time. Whereas you will see the type 6 and type 7, which are volatile and non-volatile, have a place in the chart above. And then you can also see in the chart above, wherever there's red is where our new recommendations are. So there's changes to current zoning that we've recommended, as well as the recommendations for zonings for licenses that don't exist here yet.
What's HAR?
Recommended
Recommended what?
by LCCA.
So basically, any Rs on the chart are things that the LCCA recommends, but only in
Oh,
certain.
okay. Well, some of them are asterisks and some of them are just. R.
Right, and so the Rs in black are the ones that pertain to the retail recommendations that we've already submitted.
Okay.
And the ones with the asterisks there, meaning there's further discussion.
So it's just recommended, it's not indicative of what type of permit.
Correct. We didn't
Correct.
break it down in this chart based on minor or major use permit. We can do that for the recommendations that were already made, but we kind of wanted to kick it off with just like, here's where there are gaps that we'd like to fill, and then this can be a starting point for discussion, because it could also be up to the task force, if we feel that it's more appropriate to have a minor or major use permit, or things like parcel size minimums to allow those activities, other such things.
And what is the F again?
The what? There's an F.
That to me looks like an R that got cut off.
Oh, okay.
Is that right, or is that? an
Yeah, I
F?
think those look like ours.
Yeah, right
Okay.
here.
Right, yeah.
Yeah,
Otherwise, I'm dying to hear what
It's a
that
printing
means.
error.
I know, I'm like,
Yeah.
yeah.
Keep it clean,
Okay,
people.
okay, got it.
Yes,
I'm
if
gonna-
you're
I'm gonna write that
specifically
down.
referring to temporary special events and nursery,
Yeah.
yeah, those are ours.
Okay. I'm like, did I miss something? Thank you.
So I'm not sure, in which order we want to go and talk about the license. We can give definitions of the license types that are available, that we have not listed before, or the full license type definitions that were sent out in the packet earlier. And then we can go by zone or by license, whichever the group first.
So all these licenses, are these all inclusive as to what somebody could apply for through the state?
Correct.
Okay. So we're not like leaving anything out or?
No,
Okay.
and that was my goal, is to make sure that we touched on every single thing that is available.
And are there gonna be any changes to license types?
What is the new license type coming up?
So there's potential for a catering license type.
Oh, that's right.
Oh, yeah, catering.
That didn't make it through last year, so, and then cafe, I think would just be an expansion of what's allowed under
Retail.
current retail and consumption. Yeah.
There's just to clear up a couple of things. There's also a type 5 license available for large cultivation, but that's limited to just that single operation. And then also I notice you have nursery down here. Recommended to add it, but it's actually included up here. It's type 4 and it's available through here. There was some confusion, and I've worked with the DCC to clear up that confusion in terms of allowing nurseries through a handful of language that's found both at the DCC and within our ordinance, both that were interpreted by past staff to suggest that nurseries could not be located or incorporated within an outdoor cultivation operation, which is to a certain extent true. However, the DCC clarification for this, which was recently established with them, is that they just must be on separate premise. And primary reason for that is that the nurseries operate quite differently than, your outdoor cultivation or even mixed light cultivation, which both of which will allow for, a set, a space for plant propagation. So a farmer could have their own farm and then they can dedicate a certain part of their cultivation area for plant propagation so that they can start their own plants and then plant their canopy areas. Nursery licenses are primarily focused at creating those baby plants and then distributing them among other cultivators. So the path has been opened up. People are now applying for. We're going to see our first few projects that have incorporated nurseries with them. However, they have put them on separate premise is the key, because at the same time, the outdoor cultivation or any cultivation is taxed on square footage, where the nursery licenses are taxed on gross receipts. So I did want to clarify that factor, just as I've worked my way through it over this past spring. And yeah, that's about it.
And I gave it its own separate line item because we do have a number of recommendations for different zoning on it based upon this model, so.
And as an industry as a whole, I'm not sure if you're aware of, there have been some cannabis viruses, cannabis disease that have plagued cannabis cultivation across the across the country. Actually, I listened to a long radio segment on it, and people in Massachusetts and labs were analyzing this stuff. And it's one thing, and one of the biggest ways that these viruses get spread from farm to farm to farm is by distributing clones. So again, trying to be vertically integrated, having our own nurseries here within the county that we control within the county and provide those, you're going to reduce that risk of spreading some of those cannabis viruses.
See nothing.
Okay, so let's go through line item. It looks like there are no changes to cultivation right now, which is consistent with the priority list that you just presented. Looks like manufacturing, the recommendation is to not just limit it to M2, but also to do M1 and manufacturing park. Hold on, let me get the right.
There's, and
Type 7.
Yeah, so in addition to heavy industrial, the recommendation is to add it to commercial and manufacturing, as well as industrial park district, which I have actually never seen. Any parcel zoned manufacturing park district. I'll have to take a look at that. I wonder if we even use it.
The only other thing that I might add is under the type 6, I know we've had this conversation about mechanical manufacturing, which would be considered type 6 under the state, but that there may be small farms that would like to produce their own hash on site, and that I think some of those folks fall under areas where type 6 may not be allowed currently. Just acknowledge that there's a difference between CO2 and ethanol, which the state considers non-volatile, and I think our fire department would disagree, not to speak for them, but that there may be an ability for the county to add on for a small farmer to do bubble hash or ice water hash, which is just really involves a washing machine and ice water, which is a really, and some racks to dry them on.
So you're saying then that you would request an alteration or an amendment to the definition?
Right, that the county would have a specific potential definition for an additional zoning districts where that one type of a type 6 would be allowed. And so the county would place the restriction. The state would still consider that a type 6, but the county would say, hey, if you are a small farm and you don't meet the road standards that fire wants you to meet, you can't put CO2 or ethanol on your farm, but you might be able to wash on your farm. And that would be something that the county would be able to specify and restrict.
So that's not included in this table, are we?
No, it's not.
We'll circle back around for cultivation or facilities.
This is meant to be a kind of an overview of all the changes we'd like to make, but as we go deeper into the facilities ordinance, we can make some of these more.
This is just a person.
The development standards would be covered then, because currently we have type 6 is available in the cultivation zones. So it would just be a change in the development of it.
Right, and I think you have to have a certain
And that's not part
facility type in order to.
Yeah, and that would be in the development standards, not in like the zoning discussion.
So we can drill that down, because the zoning chart would be the first step in the development of the facilities ordinance, and then it would be all the writing that goes with it.
Yes, I'm just telegraphing that I will be pushing for something.
Okay, so before we jump in further, we've got 28 minutes left in our meeting. To me, it looks like we can do just basic intro going line by line, but we may want to put this on our agenda next meeting to do the deeper dive and actually start drawing consensus on items. Agreed.
Only if you want to get to the rest of the agenda.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, because 2 of them are mine.
Yes, understood. This is a big conversation.
We could put a pin in this whole chart and do it at the next meeting if you want to use the rest of this meeting further. We wanted to intro this.
I don't think it'll take 28 minutes or so.
We may have public
fine.
comment though too.
True, that's true.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's go ahead and we'll stop the presentation now and open it up for, let's see, task force input. I see Willie with Lake Opt Chiefs.
Yeah, real quick on she was talking about the manufacturing. Other than the water extraction process, whether it be CO2 or any other, potentially flammable, combustible, volatile process, we require to have a class 1 division 1 room, and the facility would have to be sprinklered, and that's in our ordinance within the Lake County Fire Protection District. Just a heads up.
Of course.
Thanks, Willie. Okay, public input. Looks like we got Bart. Go ahead, Bart. Bart, looks like you're still muted. Okay, we'll come back to you, Bart. Margot. Go right ahead.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for taking my comment. I wanted to express a concern that I heard in the presentation, and that relates to EIR. I live in a very small valley. I'm dependent on well water. I am surrounded by commercial cannabis growers. So if there is a neighbor who decides to grow cannabis commercially and he is going to be exempt from a hydrology report because the county has a blanket EIR, if that is correct, I am very concerned.
Thanks, Margot. Let's expand just a little to give more detail to people who aren't familiar with that level of environmental review. A programmatic EIR would do sort of a broad environmental impact review of the whole county for specific projects and impacts on those projects. In this case, cannabis cultivation as well as facilities. It would establish thresholds. So it wouldn't mean that people don't have to do the review anymore for their projects, but it would establish thresholds of significance. And so as that applicant develops their site plan and their operations plan and their water usage plans, we'd be comparing those to the thresholds that would be established from a programmatic EIR. So it wouldn't be exempting them from things, but it would be giving everyone a framework of what we considered thresholds of significance, so they could hopefully not impact those in that manner.
Okay, thank you, Myra.
Sure, and
Yeah, just to add
as well.
Go ahead, Andrew, I'll go after you.
I was going to say, just to add on to that, it's not that we wouldn't be doing the environmental review for that project. It's that we would have already done a much larger, more comprehensive environmental review pretty much for every project that could come up in the county. So we can refer to that much larger in-depth document to answer those questions.
Yeah, and
Okay.
it also helps give a more comprehensive total of environmental impact on the whole program. Whereas, when individual projects come forward, people say, well, how is this going to affect the whole county? And you're required to study your immediate neighborhood, but it looks at the totality. And that's feedback that often comes up when individual projects are reviewed. So the EIR helps give that whole picture of the whole county in addition.
Right, that's where I was confused because I understand that LCCA is interested in getting a countywide EIR, but if that EIR says, oh, well, this is a cumulative effect of grow use of water, well, maybe that applies to most of the county, but it may not apply to my part of the county.
Yeah, everybody still has to do their site-specific hydrology as well.
Very good. Okay, thank you.
Yeah,
It would require that, and there's also a state bill this year that would allow for more access and inspections of wells by the State Water Resources Board.
Thank you.
Jen, did you?
I was just to say that wasn't a request of the LCCA. It's something that was passed about 2 years ago by the Board of Supervisors.
Yeah, in April of 2021, the board had been talking about a programmatic EIR, but set it aside at that time so that it would correspond with our zoning ordinance update for cannabis. So that is a priority of the board as well. Great, Bart, it looks like you're unmuted. Go right ahead.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you so much. Earlier in the presentation, prices were referred to. I'm wondering if somebody could say what current prices are.
Crisis or crisis?
Yeah, crisis.
It is a crisis.
So the monetary prices that product is getting currently
Okay.
was referred to as having gone up. What is it?
Yeah, we're all looking at Jen. She's our farmer.
It's different for every farmer. I don't feel at liberty to discuss other people's pricing nor mine. I can tell you that there's been at least a 50% increase from last year, which is still, while it sounds significant, is not.
So where would that put current price? Even if you want to talk about it as a matter of percentage of previous pricing, what would you say the pricing is relative to 2021's?
relative to
2021? That was the all-time high.
Yeah, so
not our
2021, we're still at about 20% of what we were in 2021. And I will say that we are probably about 15% above cost of goods.
Okay, is there any further public input?
Thank you.
Bart, your hand's still up if you want to take that down. I don't see any in the room or in the Zoom, so we're going to move on. So just recap, we'll put this as our main agenda item for next meeting so we can start going through the recommendations and get the input from the task force. Excellent. So our next item is, hey Bart, your hand's still up. If you want to put that down, please. Next item is update to task force for FPZ, that's Farmland Protection Zone, and revocation process. So I did have a meeting with county council, and just to remind everybody, at the last meeting, the position of the task force was to make a recommendation for an extension of the deadline for the required conversion of outdoor into mixed light or indoor within the FPZ zone, which is set to expire the end of May. So the recommendation was to extend that deadline if the revocation wording in the ordinance was immediate. It does state somewhere in the ordinance that if you've blown past that deadline, you're revoked. So that was my conversation with county council. Does it mean that it's just instantaneous the next day, or does it mean it goes through the revocation process? It will go through the revocation process. So that means it goes on my list, which I already have a number of other ones for a variety of other reasons that will be taken to planning commission with a recommendation of revocation. So those will go at the very bottom. So if the task force would like to bring that back for a future agenda item for action, that's fine. Any questions? I've got a couple questions in this room. Sarah.
Did you also ask about the enforceability? Because the way that it's written, you cannot currently obtain the permits to comply with that ordinance.
Not specifically, just because we did touch on it, but either way, the revocation part was the part that the action was hinged on with the task force. And the enforceability was a separate issue that she's going to be looking into.
Because I think the enforceability is directly related to whether or not you can actually revoke that license. If the policy is unenforceable and illegal, then you can't take that license away. If there's no legal pathway to actually comply with what 3303 says. Is that what the number was? Ordinance 33?
I think so.
3303 was an amendment to 3103 was an amendment to 3101.
Because I'm not sure that 3103 is actually valid based on the fact that you can't get a permit even if the county asked you to.
Okay, I will follow up with the county council on that one later on.
Okay, thank you.
Can I speak to that item just briefly?
Hold on a second, Andrew, we had Nara hands raised.
Okay.
Just right before you.
Yeah, and I would say that's probably something that if any of those made it to a hearing, that would be an argument that licensee would make to probably win the revocation hearing. My question is whether you're able to prioritize in terms of what you feel is the most pressing in terms of revocation that you're looking at. So you can say like these things are you can drop them down. It's like this is not a matter of public health and safety or whatever it is.
Correct.
Okay, great.
Okay, I don't see any questions in the Zoom room, so we'll move on to the next item. Update to task force regarding board action on ag exempt structures and hoop houses. So, I know, right? We did we did have a second, or no, maybe it was a third. We did have a public hearing last board meeting regarding the temporary hoop house structures. A number of amendments were included in there, some of which the board kept and some of which they did not. So the latest and greatest version of the hoop houses has been posted already for tomorrow, reflecting the board's direction. One thing though, we do intend to request it be pulled from consent because there's additional clarification needed centering around the fire access roads, because the problem is that this task force, their recommendation was that it be exempted similar to other ag for 4290 and 4291. So the issue is that the fire code that requires no more than 150 feet distance from the structure to a fire access road is not 4290 or 4291. It is from the California Fire Code, section 503.1.1. So, and there is no exemption from it. And so I just want to make it clear to the board that while they're saying the buildings can be 3 feet minimum from other structures, and they chose not to add on the clarifying language regarding the distance of the fire road, it will still be upheld as a fire code when people apply for an ag exempt structure. So it will be, in the other parts of the ordinance, it does require compliance with state laws, specifically fire code, things like that. And so I just want the board and everybody, all the public and possible applicants to understand that compliance with the state fire code 503.1.1 will be required in order to qualify for an ag exempt structure.
So I have two questions here, and I know this has been a lot of input, Maria. So
yeah, you really vetted this one.
Yeah. First, they're not structures; they are hoops. So I heard you say building. Are we having a confusion over still what this is? Because this is not a building.
Nope, we're not confused.
Building.
This would be under the exemption that's allowed at the discretion of the chief building official for structures such as similar to shade cloth structures.
So it's at the discretion of the building official?
Well, the authority is given to the building official in the California Building Code to do an exemption for this type of a structure.
Okay.
And to interpret that the temporary hoop houses are similar to shade cloth structures. Also,
so has he done that, just to clarify?
That is the whole authority behind this ordinance, yeah. We're going that way instead of membrane structures. But we did take a look, we were trying to figure out how, what are the options here? And taking a look at membrane structures, which I think is what Sonoma County uses, that also does not exempt you from the fire access roads.
So question I have, because fire access roads is a much different topic than the spacing between the hoops, right? Like you can't drive anything between the hoops. And in many parts of California, you see rows and rows of these hoops side by side.
Mm-hmm.
And those are all subject to state fire code. So how can we be in line with that?
Well, as you see, all the ones that are side by side, the 3 feet side by side is still fine. It's the access road along those rows. So
okay.
Yeah.
Most of them are actually touching, and they're not 3 feet apart.
Yeah, they share a pole.
They share a post, which is what we're trying to get
that
to.
came up after the board meeting Tuesday, and so when we request it be pulled, that would be the time that you talk to the board about that. Because the conversation last week, for whatever reason, I don't know, when it talked about touching buildings, the discussion centered around the separation of that film of the plastic sheeting going down. So like the buildings would be touching, but they'd all be individually separated, which caused problems for access. But so after the board meeting, then somebody called me and said, okay, but we can have all these structures together without that separating film. So that part of the conversation did not come up at the board meeting last week.
Do you know what time this is agendized for tomorrow?
It was on consent, it's going to be pulled, so I don't think it'll be given a specific time.
Okay.
Yeah. So that means I'll be seeing y'all all day.
Yes.
Until we get to that item.
Hey.
One other thought would be the 2,000 square feet. And I know we talked a little bit about that if it's right now it's listed as it has to be 20 feet wide and it can be up to 100 feet long. But if you have a couple of structures that are touching each other, can you just get yourself to 2,000 square feet? And it's not, maybe you have two 20 foot wide things that are touching and you're only, 50 feet long or something like that, to get to that 3 foot setback issue.
Yeah, once it is pulled from consent, since it's not a notice public hearing, I think there is some discretion for the board, so you would make your request for these other issues. However, I just want to caution you, anything substantive to the amendment means that tomorrow would be another first hearing, and then we would go next week
Right.
for possible adoption.
Or further into the, because I think the board was saying that they didn't want to talk about this again and might punt to June if we end up in a long discussion.
There were people missing from meetings later on. So
Okay.
yeah, that's why they were going to move it to June, so they'd have full board.
Okay.
As a procedural thing, I'd like to make a request that going forward, when recommendations come out of the task force, we get all these stakeholders together at this stage. Because these are conversations that are just, this is catastrophic for the industry, for the building official to be weighing in at this final hour and not have brought this feedback forward in this group.
So I'm not sure what you mean.
When he brought in new recommendations that we could have talked about in the task force when we were tasked with doing all this, and we could have hammered
We did
it out
talk
sooner.
about road access.
Yeah, but then he came back with different recommendations in the final hour, and we could have them here, or this group, and then we wouldn't have to have these delays at the board level.
Duly noted.
Sarah, just to address,
Dates and stuff.
are you guys hearing me?
Yes.
Yes.
Just to address that, the original ordinance that was given to us to review and make recommendations were based on his input. So when that was being formulated, it was pretty much between the ag commissioner and the chief building official at that time. And I'm pretty sure he's been pretty consistent with his recommendations throughout it. We've
Also-
taken it into other territory.
But
So-
it's important to recognize that cannabis-related legislation is going to start here, but then will also likely go to the Ag Advisory Committee, then to the Planning Commission, and then finally when it gets back to the board. That's a whole bunch of sausage making, just getting it back to the board. So it's important to understand that it may not look the same, or recommendations there may be different recommendations that get added on afterwards. So don't get comfortable thinking that just because the task force has done something that it's done. So just be prepared and be girded for continued participation.
That's well understood, and I think just we should have hashed out some of these very predictable things at an earlier stage.
Or or at least a discussion about the open sides and things like that.
Well, that's good to note. So let's make sure then, like next week, going forward, that we allow proper time for deeper dives and really chewing on some things, because now we're getting into some nitty gritty. When we're talking about zoning districts and types of uses, we need to have the time that it takes for us to sort of describe, this is what that would look like, and be able to sort of visualize, is this an impact that we support, that kind of thing. So I'll ask Andrew now just to make note, and Ruby. Oh, by the way, this is Ruby Mitz, our new Office Assistant 3. So she's helping us with Planning Commission. She'll also be participating, doing clerking stuff in a number of our meetings. So sorry about that, Ruby.
Welcome, Ruby.
So Andrew and Ruby, we'll just make sure that that's probably like the only thing that's on our agenda that will take much time. So we can really allow everybody to sort of sit and think and have, but what ifs, like really give it its true vetting. That, I think, is the only way that we can sort of proactively make sure that these last minute things don't come up, because we won't have misunderstandings.
So, like, when the task force makes a recommendation, and then it has to go out to all these different advisory groups or individuals to review, is it possible then that, I'm gonna say, semi-final document can come back to this task force for review before it goes to the planning commission or it goes to the board?
Well,
Because
just
I feel
like
you
today
put
with
so much
some
time
updates.
vetting into all this stuff, and then you have another group or another entity that's just reviewing everybody's work
Right.
and marking it up.
And I do, the way I compiled recommendations, I didn't even make any changes when it first went to the board, because it would just be confusing to keep track of who's saying what.
Right.
And so in my staff report, I did make sure that each group that reviewed it, their recommendations were noted. But just like I did an update today about what's gonna happen tomorrow, I'd be happy, we can just make note that, like this next retail one, which I can't really hold for a more holistic facilities thing because it was a board request. So I'm getting that back to the board as soon as possible. But I can keep doing updates, and as things are posted, we'll try to remember to bring them in. Just because I know that this is the task force that is has the expertise on it for cannabis industry. So I can understand if you'd like to be kept updated.
And we've got really a great group of experts in here in terms of ad community and other stakeholders as well. So
sure,
to get there.
Okay, so that was my update. We do have a couple hands up in the Zoom room. If there's no further questions or discussion in this room, I'm going to go to public input. Good. All righty. Holly Harris, please go right ahead. You are unmuted, but I can't hear you.
Are you waiting for me?
No, Bart, you're next. We're waiting for Holly.
Thank you so much.
If Holly's not able to be heard, she and I emailed ahead of time, and I would be happy to give a quick encapsulation of some of what she had sent me. But
Okay.
I would rather hear from her than do that. So
She's muted again. Oh, no, now she's unmuted. But we still can't hear you, Holly.
What do you press on a phone?
Star six.
Star six.
to
Yeah, you might
unmute?
try star six and unmute on your end, Holly. We're not able to hear you. Holly, we're going to go on to Bart and we'll come back to you in a minute. Go ahead, Bart.
Hi, I'm reading the text of what's going to be presented tomorrow on the Board of Supervisors. And under hoop structure design, it says maximum height of 12 feet. I'm confused. I thought that Bill Collins suggested, since what the industry wanted was a covering for the equivalent of strawberries, that 4 feet would suffice. How did this become 12 feet? Also, I'd like clarity, please, about the spaces in between the structures. Is it 3 feet? Is it 10 feet? Is it between lengthwise or only the end? And can we please hear from the fire chiefs if we heard in the Board of Supervisors that the fire chiefs were not on board with the spacing, and I'd like to hear today, if possible, if they are okay with the spacing and exactly what that spacing needs to be.
Thanks, Bart. That 12-foot maximum height has been in the ordinance the entire time. The discussion at the last meeting determined that temporary hoop structures less than 5 feet in height were completely exempted from this, so they don't even have to apply. So this is just for temporary hoop structures between the heights of 5 feet and 12 feet. I will leave it up to the fire guys to raise their hands if they want to speak, but we're going to move on now to, I think there was a note from Holly. Did you see that in the chat, Andrew?
Let's see here. Yes, we do have a note. It says the draft ordinance on the BOS agenda is different from the one attached to the task force agenda. Which should we be looking at? And then, sorry, I'm not at my regular computer, so audio does not seem to be working.
For the board's consideration, I would refer to the one that is posted on the board agenda. And let's go on to Margot.
Hi, I have a question. Where would I find the fire road requirements for the zoning areas we'll be discussing or reviewing at the next meeting?
That would be the California Fire Code, section 503.1.1.
Thank you.
Good luck finding that online. It's not easy to find. But if you want, just feel free to reach out to our department and just ask somebody to scan it and email it over to you.
Terrific. Thank you.
Certainly. Let's see. Okay, here's Paul Blues from Kelseyville Fire. Go ahead, Paul.
All right, so just in regards to the spacing of the hoop houses, I was under the understanding when we submitted for that ordinance and everything that we had talked about that 3-foot spacing while still allowing there to be a fire department access road. We're still good with the 3-foot spacing from hoop house to hoop house, but the point of the matter is that our hose lines for our engines, all that kind of stuff, I mean, the max we've got is 200 feet. And on top of it, if the way the ordinance is currently written, we're fine with 3 foot between these hoop houses, but they have to have some sort of access roads every so often so that we can get in there. I mean, the way the ordinance is written right now, we would have to travel potentially hundreds of feet with a gurney or extricating a patient out of there. I mean, heat stroke doesn't go away from anybody just because it's cannabis vineyards, whatever it may be. So if we have to travel way out there and carry somebody back out, that's wasted time. So you don't have to have an access road every 20 feet or every 30 feet, but yeah, we need to be able to drive in there. And as the way that ordinance is set up right now, it's just they could stack hoop house after hoop house after hoop house, and we could end up walking hundreds of feet trying to make access to these remote areas to get to patients or get to fires or public assist, whatever it may be.
Thanks, Paul. Nara?
So the rows between the cannabis plants required to be able to walk between them. Right now, whether or not there's a hoop house, the row would restrict the ability to potentially carry somebody out. So I think that's I don't know that having a hoop house would necessarily change the length of a row. And the row has the cannabis plants, which can be long or can be quite tall and connected. But the rows require 3 feet between them, so there can be there's already a 3 foot requirement between each row of cannabis, so that would allow for carrying somebody out, and it wouldn't change whether that's outdoor and exposed or if it has a plastic cover over the building. I don't think.
No. So what we're saying is the way that the ordinance is written right now is that they're not allowing any room for any equipment to make access out there. It's not so much that we want to see 10 foot in between hoop houses. We're fine with the 3 foot between the hoop houses, but we need to know that there's not going to be 1,000 feet by 1,000 feet of hoop houses that are just stacked at that 3 foot, because then we're going to end up having to potentially carry a patient that 1,000 feet to get them out because we can't get a piece of equipment there to get to them.
Yeah, and you may just not be able to, depending on the length of the row, is where you're probably going to be more restricted because these buildings are often open-sided, open-aired, but it's going to be the length of the row of the cannabis plants that would potentially restrict movement and not necessarily hoop houses. Because
the hoop houses are already restricted in their length, so this has been handled.
So we're a minute over.
Okay.
This is a conversation that's going to take place tomorrow, so rest up. And going on, do we have any other public comments? We're at the public comment section of our agenda. I don't see any in the room. I don't see any on Zoom. We're going to go ahead and adjourn. Thank you, everybody, for coming today.